This is a review from Algebra 1 on completing the square. In algebra, you learn about perfect square trinomials, and you'll often see these two representations of perfect square trinomials. So a squared, and it's either plus or minus 2ab plus b squared. So what this means is a perfect square trinomial has a first term that's a perfect square, a last term that's a perfect square, and the middle term is the square root of the first and the last term multiplied together, so that's where the AB comes from, times 2. You learn about this model because you can learn a shortcut for factoring it, and that's what we're going to review today a little bit. So we know that when we go to factor this, I can just take the square root of the first and the last term, and I can really take the sign of the middle term. So when it's positive, I get a plus b squared. When the middle term is negative, I get a minus b squared. Let's do this with a real example. This is a perfect square trinomial in standard form. We have a perfect square, x times x is x squared. 9 is a perfect square, 3 times 3. And then the middle term is the square root of x squared and 9, so x and 3. So 3x, and then it's doubled, so 2 times 3x. We're going to go through the long way of factoring, and then we will arrive at our factored form. So please follow along with me in your notes. I know that you maybe learned different ways of factoring, but I always show my students that when we're going to factor, we're going to make an x. We're going to find the product of the coefficient, basically the values a and c from our standard form, and then we're going to find our b value. And when I say a and c, I'm really talking about a being the coefficient of x squared, b is the coefficient of x, and c is our constant term. So that's how you usually see standard form represented. So in this case, a is the number 1. So a times c is just 1 times 9, which is 9. B is the middle term, and really the coefficient of the middle term. Since it's negative, this is negative 6. So then what we're going to look for is two numbers that multiply to 9 and also add to negative 6. Well, I always think about my factors of 9. I really only have two choices. I have 9 and 1 and 3 and 3. Well, I guess 4 choices, because we could say negative 1 and negative 9, negative 3 and negative 3. So if you ask yourself which of those are going to add to negative 6, we're going to use negative 3 and negative 3. All right, so as we write this out, you guys learned in Algebra 1, or you probably learned, that when you have a coefficient of 1 for x squared, so when you have 1x squared, you don't have to go through all of the factoring by grouping steps. There's sort of a shortcut in here that you can take these two numbers and you could write this in factored form as x minus 3 times x minus 3. And we really save ourselves sometimes with grouping. But the final way that we're going to write this, because it's x minus 3 times itself, when we go to write this in factored form, we can really write this as x minus 3 in parentheses squared. And that's the same as saying x minus 3 times x minus 3, like we have over here. So this is what a perfect square trinomial would look like in factored form. The shortcut, if you know it's a perfect square, is to take the square root of the first term, the square root of x squared, we get x, the square root of the last term, the square root of 9 is 3, and then the sign of the middle term. So since that middle term was negative, we're going to put a negative here. We put it in parentheses and raise it to the power of 2. Let's do a second example together, And we're just going to practice completing the square of a perfect square trinomial. So what value of c would make this a perfect square trinomial? And here's what we can do. First, remember that we said our perfect square form is that we have a square for our first term. Our middle term is going to be the square root of the first and last times 2, and then we have our last term. So we're really trying to figure out what this b squared value is in this equation. So it's really easy to do. If you just look at this middle term, it's 18x, and I know that really I multiplied 2 times x times some other number to get 18x. So to get that other number, we could just divide 18x by 2. And when we do that, we get 9x. So 9 is really the other number that I multiplied by to get that 18x. So 2 times x times 9 is 18x. So this 9 is the square root of our c term. So c is not equal to 9, but 9 is the square root of c. So to figure out c, I'm just going to take 9 and square it, so c must be 81. So my perfect square trinomial is x squared plus 18x plus 81. Now, if I asked you to factor that, we could factor that quickly if we remember the shortcut. So our shortcut is take the first term, take the square root of x squared is x. Take your last term, take the square root of 81 is 9. Look at the middle term and just look and see if that sign is positive or negative. Is it plus or minus? Since it's plus, I'm going to keep my plus sign. X plus 9 squared is my factored form of that perfect square trinomial.